So I've briefly been discussing and talking about what characterizes the emergence of global development agendas and some of the challenges related to compromises and implementation. Yet, despite these challenges, we still need to answer the question, how does all these global policy processes influence individual states, and how does policy spread? There are a number of studies that can show a correlation between policies adopted at the global level and policies adopted within nation states. But how does it happen? How do states interact, and how do states interact with global institutions, and how does policies spread among states? Some argue that this is all about learning, policy learning. But in the case of the SDGs, we haven't learned any lessons yet, or at least not in 2015 when it was adopted. This is mostly about ambitious goals that we do not know exactly how to go about. Other studies suggest that policies spread simply due to geography, that politicians aim to look like their neighbors. Or is it ideology? Some studies have suggested that states tend to adopt policies that make them look like the states that they share an ideology with. However, the SDGs, I think, cannot be confined to these aspects because its reach is all across the globe and includes all kinds of ideologies. So you have other studies that suggest that the industrialization makes us all gradually face some of the same challenges. Thus, it's a process of independent policy convergence. In addition, you have globalization that makes states more connected. Surely, I think this can explain some of the appetite for the SDGs. After all, we are facing some of the same challenges, such as climate change and pandemics, migration, war, instability, etc. However, to open that black box of what happens and how, I think we need to unpack the phenomena of emulation and policies, policy convergence and policy transfer, what some call policy circulation. How does it really happen? And to do this, I think we need to move down to individual actors and their actions. We need to study how individual actors interact with each other, how they interact with new information in different settings where they meet. Liam Swiss has written a book called The Globalization of Aid, where he documents how this vast industry of donors, experts, consultants, firms, NGOs, a very diverse group, are concentrating their efforts more and more on similar development priorities and objectives. And he focuses on the micro level and analyzes donor agencies, how these agencies mediate signals from global institutions, and that individual policy entrepreneurs within these agencies play an important role in spreading these norms and policies. First of all, bureaucracies. Modern politicians rely heavily on their civil servants, and bureaucratic activism is a key process in understanding how donors' priorities are shaped by international policy trends. According to Swiss, bureaucrats champion different issues and they work behind the scenes, and they even undertake actions not authorized by the political leadership. And they are also strategic in how they recruit. So they are recruiting individuals that they know are familiar with some certain agendas and issues. Hence, the aid administration, I think, with its considerable influence over policy making, constitutes an important source of policy diffusion or policy circulation. As such, there seem to be sort of a layer of internationalized expert community that most likely function as a bloodstream for many of these ideas, policies and norms coming from international meetings and assemblies. They produce and disseminate expertise that policymakers are dependent on. The aid business is full of so-called epistemic communities, professionals who can produce policy-relevant, authoritative knowledge on highly technical issues, and they often share beliefs and are usually connected through these international networks. And in addition, bureaucrats collaborate a lot with interest groups and civil society groups who are constantly trying to follow and promote so-called best practices, usually coming from global processes or some international think tank or research community. In some countries, such as Norway, my country, the frequent personnel exchange between NGOs, the bureaucracy, academic institutions, strengthens this dynamic. And another important point that Swiss makes, and this is also a familiar point in a lot of policymaking theories, is that there is so much uncertainty when it comes to development and aid. Who knows what works in which countries at what time? That's a million-dollar question, right? In addition, policymakers are rationally bounded. So they have their cognitive limits, they have their time limits, their capacity is limited. And as such, as a politician, you simply can't start from scratch. You can't keep an overview over the entire policy portfolio. Take again Norway as an example. For decades, Norway has been supporting development work in around 100 plus countries in a number of different sectors. And it's impossible for any politicians to keep track of that. Therefore, for many politicians, the act of reflecting and adopting new signals and policies from global institutions is a way of justifying what they're doing. If the World Bank or the United Nations is saying that this is the trend or this is the best practice, who are we to oppose that? We better get in line. And by doing that, you can also cut short policy process, the entire policy process, and you can demonstrate action in a way that is also considered legitimate. Sometimes countries are even triggered to develop policies just so that they will not be embarrassed by not having anything to show for when they are sitting at some high-level political forum in Paris or New York, where the latest best practice is supposed to be discussed. So they develop policies as a response to the agendas in some of these meetings. So you see, policy transfer from global institutions to nation states resembles very much policy transfer between states. It's quite normal, actually, that states emulate other states' policies without the importer necessarily understanding why and how the policy worked in the exporter society. Another interesting insight from policymaking theories is the way in which the SDGs represent some kind of a policy window. For most of these actors within the policy area of aid and development, the SDGs represents a unique policy window to get their ideas across. You would have to be working on a very remote and strange theme if what you are working on is not somehow included in the SDGs. There are synergies across sectors everywhere. Thus, I would argue that the SDGs represents perhaps the biggest policy window ever created within the area of development and aid. And as such, it's not a policy, it's more like a malleable, legitimizing idea that you can wrap around your engagement.